Good morning and welcome to the IEA Low Carbon Gas Day today on the theme of the role of low carbon gases in decarbonization pathways. My name is Jad Mawad. I am the head of communication here at the IEA. We're very delighted to have you all in our webinar today with a very long day and presentations. And we will start our event this morning with the IEA Director of Energy Markets and Security, Mr. Keisuke Sadamori, who will give opening remarks. And after that, we will have our first session on pathways and roadmaps. So before we introduce our panelists for the first session, I would like to turn the floor to Mr. Sadamori, please.
Dear colleagues, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So today, it is my pleasure to open the IEA's very first Low Carbon Gas Day, which aims to facilitate the international dialogue on low carbon gases, promote mutually beneficial partnership, and facilitate information dissemination. The historic context cannot be ignored. So besides the human tragedy and suffering it is causing, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia created a moment of unprecedented market uncertainty, the fueling volatility, and price spikes across all key energy commodities. Intraday, the gas prices on the TTF, the Europe's leading gas hub, soared to an all-time high of over $100 per million BTU in the aftermath of the Russian invasion, and have averaged at over $40 per million BTU, and that's more than 8 times higher compared to their 5-year average. Oil prices have also swung violently since the Russian invasion, with the global benchmark nearing the all-time high of $147 per barrel at times, putting the still fragile and uneven global economic recovery at risk. On the 1st of March, the IEA member countries unanimously agreed to an initial stock release to alleviate tightness in oil markets resulting from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that led to a 62.7 million barrel release, and making it the largest stock release in the history of the IEA. The recent events highlight that energy security remains a top priority, and the fact that energy systems face significant risks if they rely too much on one supplier for a key element. In the case of the European Union, Russia accounted for around 45% of gas imports in 2021 and almost 40% of its total gas consumption. In the face of the emerging global energy crisis triggered by Russia's invasion, the International Energy Agency has developed 2 10-point plans with actionable measures which can reduce reliance on oil and natural gas already in the short term. So measures identified in our 10-point plan to reduce European Union's reliance on Russian gas could result in the EU's annual call on Russian gas imports by over 1/3, while remaining consistent with the European Union's climate ambitions and allowing to refill European gas storage facilities in line with historical averages by the beginning of the next heating season. The agency's 10-point plan to cut oil use identified actionable measures which could cut oil demand in advanced economies by 2.7 million barrels per day within the next 4 months, reducing the impact of a potential loss of large amounts of Russian supplies. In this context, the security of supply benefits of domestically produced low carbon gases cannot be overlooked, as they effectively can reduce the reliance on fossil fuel imports and enhance the resilience of energy markets already in the medium term. And this is well echoed in the European Commission's Repower EU plan, which foresees a strong push for diversification of gas supply through the more rapid scale-up of both biomethane and the low-carbon hydrogen production in the European Union by 2030. The existing natural gas infrastructure can act as an enabler in the deployment of low carbon gases by providing network access, reducing transport costs, and ultimately facilitating their integration into the broader energy systems. And given the need, the immediate need to speed up the deployment of low carbon gases, the industry, infrastructure, and regulation should begin adapting now to enable their cost-efficient integration into the gas system in the future. As such, an orderly transition from the current gas systems to a model integrating multiple gases will require prudent market design from the early stages to take into consideration the network integration challenge and changing supply flexibility of low carbon gases, and ultimately the implications for the security of supply. So International Energy Agency will continue to lead on low carbon gases through our modeling and the tracking work, information dissemination, and the facilitating international dialogue in years to come. So I look forward to the active, productive discussions today. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sadamori, for your introduction. And I'm now delighted to open the first session on low carbon gases, pathways, and roadmaps. We have three panelists with us today. We will start with an introduction by Mr. Tim Gould, the Chief Energy Economist here at the IEA. This will be followed by Mr. Mechthild Worsdorfer, the Deputy Director General at the Directorate General for Energy at the European Commission. And then we will hear from Mr. Taishi Noda, the Director of the Gas Market Office at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan. Following these presentations, we will have an opportunity for a quick Q&A session. I would like to note that Ms. Worsdorfer will have to leave a little bit before the Q&A or for another commitment. And with that, I would like to turn to Tim for the first intervention, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jad. Thanks very much to Director Keisuke Sadamori for those introductory words. It's a great pleasure to join this Low Carbon Gas Day. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope you can see the slides that I'm now showing, because what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to walk through a topic which has in fact been, as was mentioned by Keisuke Sadamori just now, it's been quite a big feature of our IEA ministerial over the last 2 days. And we've really had two big themes. There's the climate change, but also energy security in the light of the brutal invasion by Russia of Ukraine. And I think low carbon gases find themselves very much at the intersection of those two huge concerns. So I'm going to talk about low carbon gases on the road to net zero. And so it makes sense to start with a little review of where we are along that road. And what you're looking at the moment on the screen is where our expectations were for global CO2 emissions prior to the Paris Agreement. And you can see that a lot has changed since then. So if we look at the policy landscape as it exists today, the detailed policy landscape, then you get a stabilization of emissions to 2050. I think we're all aware a stabilization at a high level in global emissions is not in any way consistent with a stabilization in global temperatures, but still progress since the Paris Agreement. When we factor in all of the new pledges that have been made by governments, and indeed pledges that were made at Glasgow itself, that's the orange wedge on the screen that you can see right now, then you do start to see quite a different picture for the future compared with the past. So every decade since the Industrial Revolution, energy-related CO2 emissions have risen if governments implement their announced pledges, and we are all aware that that's a big if, but if that happens, then you get continued growth in the global economy, but you get a reduction over time in energy-related CO2 emissions. But there's still a big gap between that kind of trajectory and what would be necessary to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and that would be consistent with a 1.5-degree stabilization. And the reason I wanted to start with this slide is because I'm going to mention scenarios during this presentation, and you will see stated policies, also known as STEPS, announced pledges, APS, and net zero by 2050, NZE, and this slide, I hope, provides orientation for that discussion. because my next slide is quite busy, but what it does is shows you what happens to fuels in those three scenarios. I think the first point to make is that even though electrification and efficiency are two pillars of energy transitions, keep in mind that roughly 50% of final consumption in 2050 in our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. So in a 1.5 degree stabilization, 50% of total final consumption comes from fuels of different kinds. And of course, the composition of those fuels changes dramatically from what we have today. But I think if you compare the outcomes for liquids, gases, and solids, you'll see that, you know, gaseous fuels retain their position in the mix much more strongly than other types of fuels. So the level of gaseous fuel use in 2050 in the NZE is roughly equivalent to where we were globally in 2010, while the trajectory for solid and liquid fuels is one of much more precipitous decline. I think before going on to the details on the gas side, I do have to mention that a precondition for any discussion about the role of gases in energy transitions is the need to reduce methane leaks to the atmosphere. It's not only a problem for the gas industry, and there are large leaks also associated with oil and coal, but it is a problem for the future of gas if this is not tackled. And you can find all of our views and all of our estimates on that in the methane tracker, which is something that we updated and expanded in February of this year. And there's really a major scientific effort underway now to increase our understanding of methane emissions. There are new studies appearing all the time, new measurement campaigns, and satellite data of the sort that you see on the screen. It's making this a very dynamic area. And we've tried to incorporate all of those new insights. And the picture that we get is still a very worrying one. So methane emissions from the energy sector, in our view, went up in 2021. And that's around 180 billion cubic meters of gas leaked to the atmosphere from fossil fuel operations alone. And aside from the negative impacts on global warming, and that's an astonishing waste of gas in a year or in a period when markets have been so tight. So I emphasize once again that this is an urgent first order task for any discussion around the role of gas through transitions and the role that it can play also in secure and affordable transitions. So let's zoom in a minute on the role of gases. And I'm going to put up on the screen those three scenarios that I talked about. And this is just unabated natural gas demand by scenario. And you immediately see the different trajectories that we have. But I would also like to point out that at the moment in our scenarios, over the next 5 years, there is a large degree of concordance among those three scenarios. The dynamics underlying those global numbers are quite different. But that points to, that near-term positive role that natural gas can play in transitions. And of course, we will need to look very carefully at those kinds of projections when we prepare this year's World Energy Outlook in the light of the extraordinary high prices that Keisuke Sadamori referred to at the start of our session today. But if we apply the net zero principle to gas, and that really only leaves three options for that net zero destination system, you either put CCUS on the downstream, on gas-fired power plants or gas-based industrial facilities, or you put CCUS in the upstream to produce hydrogen from gas with CCUS, or you have to move away from fossil gas completely and go to hydrogen via electrolysis or biogases or power to methane and so on. And what I wanted to do on this slide is to build up the picture of what that gas demand looks like in the net zero scenario. So we start with the trajectory for unabated natural gas, and then we start to build it up again. This is gas use downstream with CCUS, likely to play, in our view, quite a strong role in countries with large gas resources and supportive policy stance for CCUS, most importantly, North America and the Middle East. So that's CCUS wedge, around 225 billion cubic meters of natural gas in 2050 are used with CCUS in the electricity and industrial sectors. And that's mainly around extending the operations of young facilities and avoiding or reducing anyway the risk of stranded assets. But then come in two extremely important additional wedges: the hydrogen picture, both produced from gas with CCUS, and then also hydrogen from electrolysis. And you can see the orientation there of the split that we have over time between those two sources of hydrogen. So that's around 60 exajoules in 2050, and around 1/4 of that total is then converted into hydrogen-based fuels. Most of the increase in the latter part of those in this scenario, so after 2030, comes from the transport sector, but there's significant use also in industry and in power. And just to confirm what you could probably eyeball, 2/3 of that hydrogen production in 2050 comes from electrolysis, the remainder from natural gas with CCUS. There are very strong regional variations in how that plays out. And around more than 900 BCM of natural gas is converted to hydrogen with CCUS in 2050. And the electricity required to produce the hydrogen in the yellow wedge is extremely significant. The electricity required for that, to produce that, is more than current electricity demand in China and the United States combined. So that is really a significant amount of additional generation capacity that would be required. And then on top of that, we have also the contribution from biogases. And I know there'll be plenty of discussion in today's session on hydrogen, but I wanted to make sure that biogases are not left out of this picture. So I want to say a couple of words about the way that they fit into our vision of the future as well. And for some analysis that we did a couple of years ago, we put together a detailed bottom-up assessment of the technical potential of these low carbon gases, of biogases and biomethane. And important to emphasize, we were focusing only on sustainable feedstocks. So crop residues, animal manure, municipal waste, wastewater sludge. And we looked at this and varied it quite significantly across, or the feedstock availability varies quite significantly across different regions, and costs of course, are heavily influenced by the type and availability of feedstocks as well. So this is where the cost curve for biomethane looks today, and emphasize this doesn't include energy crops. And so in our assessment, it's crop residues, animal manure, the largest sources of feedstock, particularly in developing economies where the agricultural sector plays a key role. The majority of this potential comes from anaerobic digestion with upgrading, with around a 20% share for gasification from solid biomass. And you can see at the horizontal axis, there's around 30 exajoules of biomethane potential around the world in our view, and that's equivalent to around 1/5 of the world's total natural gas demand today. And how does this work out in terms of the average cost of biomethane? If you're looking at biogas upgrading, the average cost is around $17 per MBTU, and that rises to around $22 per MBTU via the gasification route. Naturally enough, with the sorts of natural gas prices that we see today, that provides a new context for assessing the competitiveness of biomethane. And we estimate now that around 20 exajoules can be developed below the average import prices that we're seeing in Asia and Europe. However, we can't just rely on what may prove to be, a few years of higher gas prices in order to get biomethane into the mix. There's an extremely important role also then for policy support in developing biomethane. And we need to eventually move towards a market that differentiates different types of gases based on their emission performance, rather than relying on commodity price shocks as a spur for development. And now moving across to how that picture changes when we go to 2050. Growth in agricultural residues from the, crop residues from the agricultural sector and municipal waste gives us a lot of additional potential to develop biomethane by mid-century. So that's around 50 exajoules, which is around 1/3 of today's natural gas demand. And then the costs also come down over time. So the average cost of developing this biomethane in 2050 comes down to around $13.5 per MBTU, thanks to learning effects and economies of scale. So where does that go? If we look at biogas today, around 70% of that goes to power and heat, 20% for cooking purposes in developing economies, maybe mainly, and the other 10% is upgraded to biomethane. So more than half of biogas production today takes place in Asia, which also has the largest growth potential. Extending that view out to 2050, biomethane at least 4 times larger than today, and in the NZE, so in that net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, biomethane captures a much bigger share of remaining gas demand, with a number of regions seeing blending rates of 20 to 40% by mid-century. But I just wanted to relate that number. So you've got about 14 exajoules. I mean, that's only around 1/4 of the total sustainable potential that we've identified. A significant proportion remains too costly to develop in that scenario. And it's also true that biogas and biomethane have to compete for support with other forms of bioenergy. A few words to conclude on the hydrogen picture. I mean, we're all aware that many governments are stepping up their own support, having hydrogen strategies and so on, and we'll be hearing no doubt more about that in a minute from our other keynote speakers today. And these strategies often focus on targets for hydrogen supply, but I think it's extremely important, as indeed is the case in Europe and Japan, to pay attention to the policies needed to stimulate demand, both for low carbon hydrogen and for hydrogen based liquids. You can see from the slide that if we look at our scenarios to 2030, there's still a very large difference between the amount of hydrogen that comes into the system under those announced pledges and the amount that would be necessary, in our view, in a net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. So I think it's extremely important to see at the moment, in today's context of much higher gas prices and indeed much higher concern over gas security, how much that gap will be filled with new projects. And my final slide is really to take a look at the international dimension of this and the way that hydrogen starts to appear in international energy-related resource trade. And this is the picture that we had in 2019, looking at the value of the different energy-related commodities that are traded. No surprise that oil is well out front there. But then look at the picture. How would that look different if all of those announced pledges were implemented by mid-century? And you start to see some new kids on the block. Critical minerals become that much more important for reasons that we're all aware of with their critical role that they play in many low carbon technologies. But then hydrogen also coming through very strongly because of those, even though pretty much everywhere in the world has the potential to produce hydrogen, differences in production costs do create incentives for trade. And in this scenario, most of that early trade is going into Northeast Asia, notably from Australia, from some countries in the Middle East and Latin America. And if you go fully for a net zero emissions world by 2050, then the structure and value associated with international energy trade is completely overturned from the picture that we have today. So rising demand for lithium, nickel, cobalt, rare earths, copper as well. But then hydrogen becomes such an important element of that internationally traded picture as well, even though most hydrogen is, of course, produced at home. So there are all sorts of transitions that we have to look out for in low carbon gases over the next decades. And I hope that this presentation has given you a sense of how that picture looks in the scenarios that are being produced by the International Energy Agency. Thank you so much for your attention.
Many thanks, Mr. Gold, for your perspective. And I would like now to turn to our second panelist, Ms. Mechthild-Worsdorfer, who's going to provide the view from the European Union on the role of low carbon gases. Ms. Worsdorfer, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon to everybody. And thank you very much, Keisuke Sadamori and colleagues from the IEA for inviting me, and already congratulations to all of you for really indeed very, very successful IEA ministerial the last 2 days in Paris. So the low carbon gases have also in the European Union always played a quite important role, but the European Commission has set a target on the European Green Deal to become carbon neutral by 2050 and to reduce carbon emissions by 55% by 2030. And that's the framework the Commission has set 2 years ago. I must now underline the current situation, and the Russian invasion in Ukraine has only accelerated what we want to do under the European Green Deal, and that has affected all our work rather dramatically when we are speaking both clean energy transition, but also energy security has again come at the forefront of our work. So we have now been discussing in the last couple of weeks a number of issues which will accelerate what we have already planned in the area of decarbonized gases and low carbon gases and renewable gases. So I will outline both aspects, what more recently and most recently has accelerated our debate on low carbon gases, but also the regulatory framework we are planning in the European Union to really create a market, both demand and supply for those gases in the context of the decarbonization and security of supply. Let me start that the European Union is very dependent on gas imports and oil imports, and that we have seen this dependence growing over time, and the fact that the European Union is dependent on Russian gas for 40% of its import, on Russian oil on 25%, and coal 45%, has triggered now in the last months since the invasion a completely new debate at a very high level on security of supply and the need to reduce this dependency on Russian fossil fuels in this decade to a maximum. And that's why, for example, today, the heads of governments and states here in Brussels are looking at the issue of further security of supply, concerns, energy prices, which is very much related. And I think Keisuke Sadamori mentioned that as well, and that what we can do to accelerate. So we very much welcomed in that context what the IEA has done with a 10 points plan, both on gas and oil. It was extremely helpful and extremely timely to our debate here in Brussels on what we are thinking of and what the way we are doing. So we have on the 8th of March adopted a communication proposing a European joint action for affordable, secure and sustainable energy, taking into account all what I described before. And that what we call Repower EU plan is really mainly about to get rid of our dependence from Russian fossil fuels well before 2030. And in Europe,
I think we have a slight issue from the feed from Ms. Worsdorfer. We'll see if she's going to be logging back in, or maybe give her a second. If not, I probably should it's not coming back. Apologize for this technical delay. I'm going to give Ms. Worsdorfer 10 more seconds perhaps to log back in. Okay, if not, maybe I will then turn to our panelist from Japan, Mr. Taishi Noda from METI. If you would like to perhaps step in oh, I can see, sorry, apologize for this. I think Ms. Worsdorfer is back. Mechtil, if we could turn back to you, you froze there for a couple of seconds.
Thank you very much, Jed. I'm sorry for that. I don't know what the connection problem was, but let me just focus on what we have decided as recently as 2 weeks ago. Really, the focus is to diversify our supply, massively invest in renewable, boosting energy efficiency, and develop all clean technologies. And in this context, the renewable liquid and gaseous transport fuels of non-biological origin, such as renewable and low carbon hydrogen, have an essential role to ensure the integration of our EU energy system and ensure our climate neutrality by 2050. And I will just concentrate on where we have stepped up our ambitions on renewable hydrogen. First, we will diversify supply and we will bring in more renewable gases. And one aspect here is doubling the sustainable production of biomethane compared to the Fit for 55, meaning the European Green Deal objectives, from 17 BCM to 35 BCM by 2030. And we should aim to increase the production, but also the import of renewable hydrogen. And here the objective is to have by 2030 additional 15 MT of renewable hydrogen on top of the 5.6 foreseen already. And there is a need to some new cross-border gas infrastructure, which should be hydrogen compatible and use the maximum, the existing infrastructure as well. We also work and continue to work with partners to conclude green hydrogen partnerships and with the industry to establish a global European hydrogen facility. So we really want to boost, and that's the focus in the EU, on the access to affordable renewable hydrogen. And we will also support pilot projects in the production and transport of the EU neighborhood, and we start with a Mediterranean green hydrogen partnership. So this is really something we are stepping up in the current context of the Russian invasion. But when we look at what Europe can do and how to create that demand and supply, we have started end of last year with what we call a hydrogen and gas markets decarbonization package. So the aim is really over time to reduce natural gas and to speed up low carbon gases. And therefore, I think we are one of the first to have established and proposed end of last year a real framework to look how renewable hydrogen, biomethane, biogas, e-gases can really come to the market in a sustainable way. And this package, we have 5 goals, and I will only quickly mention them. I think my colleague will later specify much more. So first of all, we are proposing to establish a framework for a European hydrogen market, which goes hand in hand with a dedicated hydrogen infrastructure network. And that for us is crucially important for industry who need that certainty to invest in decarbonizing their production processes. I think we are the first one which are really establishing a clear regulatory framework for hydrogen. And here we have our goals, which are in our hydrogen strategies, and most of the EU member states have all, in addition to that, national strategies. And we want Europe by 2030 to have a competitive, open, and dynamic hydrogen market. And here, timing is crucial. What we propose is a regulatory framework centered around proven regulatory principles, which we also already have in the electricity and gas networks. And that, in our terms, includes rules for third-party access, unbundling, as well as tariff regulation. And in order to take into account the developing of this market, we propose a staged development. That means a two-phase approach before and after 2030. Before 2030, we will give the companies the flexibility they need for the hydrogen market to emerge. And then to provide more certainty for investors, we already now propose to define the main regulatory principles for mature markets after the 2030. So this is crucial because we want to really ensure also the convergence of the regulatory treatment of initially dispersed hydrogen network elements. So we have in Europe a European Organization of Transmission System Operators for electricity. We have one for gas, and we propose in our recent proposal a dedicated one for hydrogen. And that would be really separate entity to really who is best placed to develop that dedicated hydrogen infrastructure and the market in the future. Of course, the three of them would need to work closely together, but we really want to strengthen a dedicated hydrogen market in the future. The second aim of this package from last year is really to pave the way that the renewable and low carbon gases can access the existing natural gas system. So it's clear that our priority in Europe is the ramp up of renewable hydrogen production and consumption, because we believe they are best aligned with the EU goal of climate neutrality in 2050. But we also recognize that in a transitional period, and certainly from now on already, if we want to speed up, low carbon hydrogen is absolutely needed. So we need to help scale up the market and rapidly reduce the emission from existing hydrogen production. So we have looked at scenarios and different options in that context. And we define in our strategy the low carbon hydrogen as fossil-based hydrogen with carbon capture, and electricity-based hydrogen will both reduce the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions compared to existing hydrogen production. And we are introduce here a more stringent definition of what low carbon hydrogen is, which is requiring greenhouse gas emission savings of at least 70%. So in that package, we speak about low carbon hydrogen and we give a definition. And in our renewables framework and directive, we speak about the renewable hydrogen only. We try to remove any cross-border tariffs for those gases so that there is a significant reduction of at the entry point of the networks, and this will allow for cross-border trade within the EU and support the upscale and access of gases, which will be largely produced domestically, like biomethane is very often domestic or even regional, local, and we have a number of our EU member states like Denmark who are quite leading this debate. We also look in the package that the networks, as I explained, are well integrated. And in that sense, we would allow a certain blending of gases, low hydrogen, that is up to 5% when it comes to cross-border. So our aim is to have a dedicated hydrogen infrastructure, but we allow for the foreseeable future in our package that up to 5% can be blending. And the 5% target is for the cross-border, so that we have in the EU no obstacles that this blended gases can move around Europe. If a national at member states level, they would like to go higher for their national gas network, this is possible. And we also introduce a certification scheme, both for renewable and low carbon hydrogen. This is the second objective. The third one is a more integrated network planning between the networks. And the fourth one is to give a place to the consumer that, similar what we have in our electricity and gas market, we really want also for the low carbon gases, the right of information and tools for the consumer, so they can make the right choices and participate in the market. And the fifth aspect, and that is the one we just strengthened in the current debate, is really to reinforce security of supply. We have a solidarity between member states in the case of gas supply emergency. And this Wednesday, 2 days ago, we made a proposal to even strengthen this solidarity in case of gas supply emergencies, because we are having prepared scenarios, even worst case scenarios of no Russian gas flows to Europe. And in that case, we need to be much better prepared. And one of the aspects here, what we have proposed on Wednesday, is that we looked at the gas storages in Europe and the need to fill them before this upcoming winter. So this is a strengthened aspect of the package we have proposed, to really look at security of supply and be prepared now that we are coming out of this winter, but be much better prepared as we use 25% for gas storages as a buffer. We need to fill the storages, and that is what we are discussing in the next couple of weeks with our EU member states. So this is the framework we are working in to really create a dedicated market for hydrogen, both to create demand and supply with a focus on renewables, but also allowing low carbon hydrogen in the markets to grow. And this is absolutely necessary, as we also heard from Tim Gould, in the current context, but also on the way to net zero by 2050. There are other initiatives from our Fit for 55 package in Europe who are tackling the low carbon gases and hydrogen. I already mentioned the Renewable Energy Directive, but there are other legal frameworks like the Energy Taxation Directive, the ETS proposal, and the networks in Europe who are tackling and looking in a complementary way to make sure that there is the right framework. I just have two more comments. One is on financing. We are also aware that we need investments. We are expecting investments at EU level in the range of 320 to 460 billion euros. And that includes investments in additional renewable electricity production, which is a key factor. We want to triple renewables in this decade in Europe, but we also need a lot more renewables for hydrogen. So in order to balance that, we are looking on how to do that best, what we describe in an additionality delegated act, so that we make sure that we have renewables in the power sector, but also the renewables we need by 2030 in the hydrogen production. There is a number of funds at the EU level to allow from research to recovery to infrastructure and innovation funds to allow to take up these challenges of investments, but it's clear that we need much more private investments as well. And my very last point is the international side. We are extremely happy with the work the IEA is doing in that field and happy to cooperate even stronger. We also part of IPHE and SEM, Clean Energy Ministerial and Mission Innovation, who have also a number of work streams around hydrogen, but also low carbon gases. So I stop here and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to turn to Mr. Tashinoda from Japan, please.
Good morning. I'd like to thank Sadamori-san and IEA and the colleagues of member countries for giving me this opportunity to speak here today. Today, I'm here to talk about low carbon gases in Japan's carbon neutral strategy. My talk is divided into 3 parts. I will start with giving you the overviews on gaseous energy utilization in Japan. Then I will let you know about synthetic methane, which is key player in our strategy toward 2050. Finally, I will talk about hydrogen and biogas as other alternatives. Go to the next page, please. To start with, I'd like to give an overall picture of gaseous energy use in Japan. There are 2 types of gas use. One is power generation, and another is gas use for heating, cooking, hot water supply. The pie chart, this pie chart shows that a breakdown of LNG consumption in Japan. It shows that 64% is used for power generation and less than 36% for gas use. In addition, we use another gaseous fuel, liquid petroleum gases. My presentation today focuses on this 36% of LNG consumption for gas use. Please, next page, please. Regarding to natural gas use in Japan, we import LNG and supply it to end users through gas pipelines like this. Please go to the next page. Next page, please. Yes. This is the map of Japanese gas grids and the pipelines. As you see, the Japanese gas grids are not interconnected. Not all LNG terminals, LNG bases are connected to all grids. It means we can't send natural gas from, for instance, Tokyo to Osaka or Tokyo to Fukuoka, vice versa, Osaka to Tokyo. So only urban areas in Japan can use pipeline natural gas, so that we call that natural gas supply city gas. Go to next page. With regards to petroleum gas, liquid petroleum gas, this is another types of gas use. Cylinders filled with petroleum gas, propane gas, are delivered to each household by local LPG distributors. There are about 18,000 of local distributors all over Japan, and they are delivering gas cylinders to anywhere without gas pipeline, natural gas pipeline. I got next please. About 50% of Japanese households use city gas for heat and hot water supply, and 36% use LP gas or kerosene, and the remaining rest 14% households are all electrified. But next, please. The government carbon neutral strategy on gaseous energy toward 2050 is stated in the 6th Strategic Energy Plan and Green Growth Strategy. So especially the 6th Strategic Energy Plan released last October is the most important and comprehensive strategic document. In addition to this, now the government is considering a new strategy on clean energy. This new strategy will be announced soon. Go to next page. Regarding to the go to next page, please. Yes. Regarding to the 3 categories, power generation, city gas, and LP gas, we have a different transition strategy. Before I start to explain the detail of city gas strategy, which I am responsible for, let me briefly introduce power generation transition strategy. As you see, we should, this is a total power generation mix in 2030. So we should think about the full electricity generation mix, not just about gas-fired generation. So according to the energy plan, the ratio of the gas-fired power generation in 2030 will decrease like this. And the share of renewable energy sources will increase by 36 to 38%. And 1% will be provided by hydrogen and ammonia generation. Although the power generation mix in 2050 has not been announced yet, but I mentioned the energy plan stated that the power sector will be decarbonized. Japan is considering a hydrogen-fired power generation in the future. In the coming session, Kawasaki Heavy Industry will explain the hydrogen distribution and hydrogen-fired power generation. Go to the next page, please. And now let's go on the city gas strategy. I'm in charge, which is the main topics today. Even in 2050, gaseous energy is expected to remain as an important energy sources in Japan's energy mix. So this pie chart shows the portfolio of gaseous energy for city gas in Japan in 2050. 90% will be replaced by synthetic methane and 5% will be a direct use of hydrogen. Synthetic methane is produced from renewable hydrogen and captured CO2, and it is a derivative of renewable hydrogen, green hydrogen, and a kind of the recycled carbon fuels. That means Japan is going to replace 95% of natural gas use of city gas with renewable hydrogen. Go to the next page, please. A unique aspect of Japan's strategies is synthetic methane will play key role. As you know, synthetic methane has similar characteristics of natural gas, and it is fully compatible with natural gas. It means that we can use existing LNG supply chain facilities and city gas pipeline for synthetic methane supply. We don't need to prepare special infrastructure for synthetic methane. Next page, please. Yes, synthetic methane, e-methane, can be easily blended with natural gas, and natural gas can be replaced with synthetic methane progressively toward 2050. Go to the next page, please. This picture shows e-methane utilization. We are thinking about two cases of methanation. One is importing e-methane from overseas, and another is producing it domestically. Next page, please. In the case of importing from overseas, e-methane would be produced in countries with abundant renewable energy sources and with LNG export facilities. In the initial phase, e-methane from overseas would be exported to Japan together with natural gas through existing LNG supply chain. Business partners for e-methane would be current LNG exporter countries like the US, Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Qatar, etc. Japan's two major gas utilities, Tokyo Gas and Osaka Gas, have started feasibility studies for overseas business. Go to the next page, please. Domestic methanation is also promising, and In terms of energy security, domestic methanation is preferable, of course. How to abate industries like iron steel industry or cement industry, chemical industries? They inevitably emit a lot of CO2 due to their production process. E-methane production use much CO2. Those recovered or captured from the how to abate industries, biomass generation, and DAC or etc. So in Japan, iron steel industry and cement industry have just started to develop on-site methanation technology development under the government funding. An essential element of domestic methanation is enough supply of renewable electricity or hydrogen. Although Japan is not a renewable energy rich country, but once abundant renewable hydrogen supply is realized in Japan, domestic methanation would accelerate, I believe. Go to the next page, please. I'd like to share you three challenges for e-methane use. First, cheap renewable electricity or renewable hydrogen is important. Synthetic methane is one of the renewable hydrogen derivatives. In any cases, whether we use e-methane or hydrogen, we need abundant supply of hydrogen. Second, it is necessary to establish mass production technology of e-methane, and the cost of methanation need to be reduced. Go to next page, please. So this is the roadmap for technology development of methanation. And along this roadmap, we are supporting several technology development projects. Currently, we have achieved 8 cubic meters per hour production capacity. And by 2025, 400 cubic meters per hour plant will be in operation. This plant would be the highest level production capacity in the world. By 2030, we will have 10,000 cubic meter per hour production technology. By 2050, mass production technology of 60,000 cubic meters per hour will be available. Go to the next page, please. Tokyo Gas is planning to supply 80 million cubic meters per year of e-methane in 2030, and Osaka Gas will supply 60 million cubic meters per year as well. We are very open to adopting technologies from foreign companies. We hope that companies around the world will compete in the development of e-methane production technologies. Go to the next page, please. The third, we need international rules on recycled carbon fuels, RCFs, including e-methane. E-methane is a kind of recycled carbon fuel because it needs CO2 for production. We need to establish multilateral or bilateral international rules to how to account CO2 emission from recycled carbon fuels when we import it especially when we import it from abroad. The rule must avoid the double count of CO2 emission from RCFs. We essentially would like to work together with countries who are interested in this point. Go to the next page, please. In the remaining time, let me explain about other future gaseous energy. One is hydrogen. Direct use of hydrogen is also very important for our strategy. So in Japan, several pilot projects for direct hydrogen utilization have been started. In 2023, Tokyo Gas is going to supply hydrogen to residential complex zone, Harumifura, which was the Tokyo Olympic Village. I want to say one very important thing about hydrogen. We don't have any idea to blend hydrogen into the existing natural gas grid. hydrogen blending is not the final solution, but the transition measures. Of course, it's very useful measures, important measures. But in Japan, gas utility companies strictly controls the calorific value of gas. So any change in the calorific value of gas will disrupt the operation of end users industries. Because the operation are optimized to the predetermined calorific values. So go to the next page, please. The last one is biogas. The target for biogas use is less than 5% in our future city gas energy mix. So frankly speaking, we would like to use more biogas. So I believe the EU is planning to expand the use of biogas. So and IEA colleagues also introduced the future potential of the biogas use in the world. So I'd like to learn much from the EU and the other colleagues how Japan can introduce biogas more and more. So let me introduce emerging case of biogas utilization in Japan. So in this project, biogas comes from the regional garbage incinerator facilities. So annually 1.5 million cubic meters of biogas will be collected and will be supplied to 10,000 households in that region. So that's all my presentation. That's all my presentation on Japanese transition strategy with low carbon gas. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Noda, for your presentation. And I think we have about 8 minutes, maybe a little bit more for a few questions. And since I perhaps can follow up on your presentation and ask you a quick follow-up questions that we have for Mr. Noda. You mentioned that Japan considers both domestic and overseas construction for methanation facilities. Which ones should you focus on more, and does that depend on any kind of time frame or some prerequisites?
Thank you very much for your question. It is very, very important point. Frankly speaking, it depends on the cost of renewable hydrogen because, yeah, so far the domestic renewable hydrogen production in Japan is higher than overseas one. However, as Sadamori-san said and the colleague said, energy security is more and more important in the current situation. So we should, how can I say, work harder to promoting the domestic methanation. And many Japanese companies which emit a lot CO2, like iron steel industry, cement industry, chemical industry, they are very interested in the domestic methanation. And the Tokyo Gas has just announced new technology development feasibility studies on the domestic methanation, especially focused on the cement industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll turn the question perhaps to Mr. Gould. Question on biomethane, which needs current prices to be maintained. The question essentially, if I can paraphrase it, is what would be needed? What kind of price environment would you expect for biomethane so that governments do not have to subsidize its deployment?
Yeah, thank you, Jad, and thanks for the question. And I see from the chat there's been quite a lot of discussion on prices, and one of the advantages of revisiting our scenarios every year is that, of course, we need to produce new price decks, and naturally enough, those will look different this year than they did last year, given the changed context. By the way, I was just looking at the news in the last few minutes. There's also been this announcement from the EU and US around a new task force on gas security and energy security, and some commitments there or numbers there on sort of availability of LNG supply, which is also extremely interesting and I think relevant also for some of today's discussion. But to get back to the question, I think it's true that both biomethane and green hydrogen, or hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen of all kinds, it does require some sort of supportive government framework in terms of policies. It's not just gas prices that are the driver of developments. And it's still very unclear what that new price environment will be sort of post-COVID, post the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there's still a lot of moving parts. So we would still focus also on that mix of policy and sort of other economic incentives. So issues like certifying low carbon gases for grid injection, very important. Permitting, need to fast track some of the things that would allow the targets, including the target that Mehta mentioned a while back, to be met. So I think if because I'm again keeping an eye on the Q&A, I wouldn't necessarily assume that in a high price environment, all blue hydrogen is just, completely out of the picture. Just because you need to be looking not only at the gas prices, but also the blue hydrogen production essentially would be produced by countries with lots of gas resources. So I think we need to still pay attention to the cost of production that as a relevant indicator, not only the price of internationally traded gas.
Thank you very much, Tim. To Mr. Noda, perhaps since this issue of government and private sector initiative is quite an interesting one, in your view, what would be the kind of system that promotes the development of synthetic methane? Would it be those kind of government initiative, or what's the role of private sector initiative in this question?
Thank you. Yes, private companies like Tokyo Gas, Osaka Gas will be the key players for the technology development itself. So the government will provide the financial support for them. For instance, recently the government funds, green innovation funds allocate $200 million to the methanation development project. So yeah, well, how it is, so the major player of the development is the private companies, and government supports them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this answer. And I'm just checking the time. It's 10 minutes past 10 here in Paris. This allows us to take a 5-minute break here at this point. And I'd like to thank our panelists, Mr. Noda, Mr. Gold, of course, Ms. Wursdorfer, who had to leave. After the break at 10:15 Paris time, we will come back with a second session on the IEA Low Carbon Gas Day, with a focus this time on project development by the private sector in the sphere of low carbon gases. Thank you very much for your attention. See you in 5 minutes.